today we have a fun one. You could use this to create a single wallpaper or else a subtle animation loop like this one. So without any waste of time, let's start off learning how you can create this. In our default scene, we're going to go ahead and bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows and click and drag to create a new window. We're going to change that from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor. Now we can press new to add in a new geometry node tree, zoom in, and then delete the default cube by selecting the group input and tapping X. Now we can press Shift A and search for points and just plug the geometry into the output geometry. Now the fun part about points is that we can create as many points as we want in the same region. So I'll start off with something like 250 points. Then on these points I want to instance a few lines which I'll convert into these curvy strands. So we'll press Shift A and search for an instance on points node and plug that in right after the points. And then for the instance objects, I'm going to go ahead and search for a mesh line. Now I'm going to change the type of the mesh line to endpoints so that I can change the length and keep it at a constant length of 5 meters, but I can also increase the count to something like 20 so that we get a smoother curve. Finally, I can plug this mesh into the instance and now we have 250 lines present at the same exact location. So first, let's go ahead and curve the line around. So to do that, I'm going to drag the mesh line to the side and press Shift A and search for a set position node. Then I can plug that in between the mesh line and the instance on points. And for the offset, I can control that with maybe a noise texture. So let's press Shift A and search for a noise texture and then plug the color into the offset. Now, the first thing is that we see it shifts up and to the right, and that's because the noise texture by default averages everything out to move by 0.5 units. So we'll press Shift A and search for a math node. We'll switch it from add to subtract and we'll keep the value at 0.5 itself and plug it right in, and it goes right back to the center. The second thing is that the effect is in two small increments, which makes it look more like lightning than nice wavy strands. So we'll just decrease the scale down to something like 0.4, and that way we get a much smoother curve. However, the strength is too less, so we'll press Shift A and search for a vector math node and change it from add to multiply, and then plug that in after the subtract value, and then increase the values on all of the axes to maybe something like 5. Once you've done that, again, you can play around with the scale and continue to reduce it till you get some nice smooth curves like this. So I'm using a scale of 0.15. The next thing that we have to do is actually give each of these 250 lines some random rotation. To do that, we can go back to the instance on points node and press Shift A and search for a random value node. Now, the random value node is initially going to be on float, but we need it to turn on all 3 of the axes. So we'll change it from float to vector so that we get a different random value on each of the different axes. And if we increase the max value to 2 pi, you'll get values that rotate all the way around a sphere. But we don't want it to go all the way around. We want it to clump in a region itself. So we'll keep the max value at 1 and plug it into the rotation. So that looks good for what I was looking for. And now we can give these lines some thickness. So to do that, we'll press Shift A and search for a mesh to curve node and plug that in right there, and then convert it back to a mesh. So search for a curve to mesh. And for the profile curve, we can press Shift A and search for a curve circle and plug the curve into the profile curve. Now the thickness is way too large, so of course we'll just decrease the radius to 0.01 and that'll do. The next thing is that if you actually zoom in, the curves are not smooth enough. So we can bring this out and press Shift A and search for a subdivision surface node, plug that in, and now they'll smooth out a little bit more. You can increase the level to 2 as well, and it becomes even smoother. Now, at the tips of every single one of these strands, we want a UV sphere. So to do that, we can press Shift A and search for another instance on points node, and we want both the lines as well as whatever we instance onto these points to be there. So we're going to have to move the group output to the side and press Shift A and search for a join geometry so that we can have both of them together. So plug that in there and plug this instance right down here. Now for the actual points, we're going to need the curve that we got after we converted it from a mesh to curve. So we can take this and plug this into the points. And after we plug it in, we don't want every single one of the points in this entire curve to get a UV sphere. We want only the tips to get the UV sphere. So we can press Shift A and search for a curve tip node, and that way you get the tip selection and you can plug that into the selection. Then you can press Shift A and search for an icosphere or a UV sphere. Let's use an icosphere for this and just increase the subdivisions to maybe something like 3 and decrease the radius to 0.01 and plug that into the instance. Now the tips have the icospheres, but clearly they're way too small. So we're going to change the radius from 0.01 to 0.05 or even 0.04, and that should do. Now you can switch off overlays by pressing this button, and we can see what we have, and that's good enough for the modeling section. However, if we want to animate this, you're going to go ahead and use the general method for looping noise textures. So the first step is changing it to 4D, and because we change it to 4D, I think it also makes sense to just increase the scale a little bit. So we'll maybe make the scale 0.2, and then we'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and then press Shift A and search for a mix node. We're going to have to change it from float to color, and then plug that in between the noise texture and the subtract node. Then plug the color from the second noise texture into the second socket of the mix node, and then increase the timeline a little bit, and we can go ahead and set all of our defaults while we're at it. So we'll go to the render properties, which are ambient occlusion, bloom, screen space reflections, and under the ambient occlusion, we're going to increase the factor all the way to something like 10, and maybe the distance to 1 as well. After that, we'll go to the output properties, change the frame rate to 30 frames per second, change the end frame to 150 so that it's a 5-second long animation, change the output folder to wherever you want it to be. File format is going to be FFmpeg video, and the encoding has to be changed from Matroska to MPEG-4, and the output quality is going to be perceptually lossless. Then, back on frame 0, we can hover over the W value of the noise texture and press I, and then go to frame 150 and change the W value to maybe something like 1 and press I, and then we can hover over the second noise texture W value and press I, go back to frame 0, change the value to something like -1 and press I, change the factor of the mix node all the way down to 0, and then hover over it and tap I, then go to frame 150, change the factor to 1 and press I. Then you can select all 3 of the nodes, go down here and press T linear. And then if you actually watch it, there's a very subtle swaying motion that perfectly loops when you actually watch it. Of course, if you want to exaggerate this motion, you always can by changing this from -1 to maybe something like -4 and pressing I, and then going to frame 150, changing this one to 4, and then pressing I. And that way, the motion is going to be far more exaggerated. So all of that is up to you, but I'm going to keep it as a fairly subtle motion at -2 and 2. The next thing is actually placing your camera. So we'll select the camera, press 0 to go into the camera view, then press N to open the side panel, switch it over to view, and just check the button that says lock camera to view, and then press N to hide the panel. Then you can go ahead and move your camera around till you get a composition that you like. I want the bulk of everything to stay outside my actual render view, and I'm also going to go to the camera properties and change the viewport display passport out all the way to 1 so that I don't see anything outside the camera view. Then I'm just going to play around with this till I get some location that I like, and I can also rotate the camera around its own axis by changing the coordinates from global to local, and then just rotating it on the Z a bit like that, and just moving it around till I get a position that I like. So maybe I'll go ahead with a position like this. And once I'm happy with it, again, I can press N to open the side panel and switch off camera to view. Now, in our geometry node tree with the cube selected, we have to set the materials. So before the join geometry node, we'll press Shift A and search for a set material node and plug that in for the spheres that's over here, and then press Shift D and plug that in here, which is for our strands. So now we can go to the material properties down here, and we already have a default material. We can change the name to strands, and we can select that in the set material node for our strands. And then we can press the plus button over here to add in a new material slot, press new and call this spheres, and then select that for our spheres set material node up here. Now that you have this, I also want the spheres to be shaded smooth. I'm going to press Shift A and search for a set shade smooth node and plug that in right after the set material node. Now that I have this, we can check the animation and see how it's working out. And if we like it, we can go ahead and switch our viewport shading to rendered so that we can officially see what's going on. Now, the first thing that I'll do is change this window from the geometry node editor to the shader editor, and then we have spheres already selected. So the spheres, I want them to be emissive. So I'll select the principled BSDF and press X to delete it, and press Shift A and search for an emission node and just plug that into the surface. Now I'm going to go ahead and give it a subtle yellow or orangish hue, and I'm going to go ahead and increase the strength to something like 10. After that, the rest of the lighting is going to be done using lights and screen space reflections. So we'll choose the strands and we'll go ahead and give it a more metallic value, something like 0.8. And for the roughness, we'll maybe decrease it to 0.3. Once we're done with that, we'll select the light and press Alt G to clear its location. And with the light present there itself, we'll maybe grab it on the Z to move it down by just a little bit, and then we'll increase the power from 1000 to 10,000 to make it much brighter, and this color will give it the orangish tint. Once we're happy with that, we'll press Shift D to duplicate it and move it up on the Z axis till it's outside our camera view. Grab it and just move it around till we're happy with the position, and change this one's color to a bluish color and maybe make it fairly desaturated. Along with that, we can also decrease the power down to just 2000. Then we can go to the world properties and change our world background all the way to black, or something fairly close is good enough. And we can also grab our second light down and just move it around till we're happy with its positioning. Play around with the color saturation and everything until you're absolutely sure you're happy with where it's present, and how it's influencing your scene. Once you're happy with that, I also feel like the bloom is too much, so I'll go back to my output properties, go down to bloom, change the intensity from 0.05 to 0.02, and maybe under the color management, you can change the look to maybe high contrast if you want to reduce the bloom a little bit more. But you can also change the view transform from filmic to standard with a high contrast, and you get something a lot brighter. So playing around with these values is up to you, but essentially that's all there is to creating this particular animation. Finally, to actually export it, you have to go to render, animation. Hopefully you learned something from this video and can create subtle background animations like this to use in your various projects. If you have any questions, do comment them down below and I will respond for as long as I possibly can. Thank you so much for watching, and I really do hope you watch other videos on my channel for inspiration, to learn things, and most importantly, to stay creative.